Okay, this is going to be goals and objectives. And topics we're going to discuss here is, one, what are goals and objectives, what a performance agreement is, components of an objective, terminology and precision, the relationship between the domains of learning and the objectives, and goals and objectives and the evaluation process. And essentially, goals and objectives are pretty much the backbone of instruction. Whenever you plan goals and objectives, you should determine the appropriate content for your audience. Goals and objectives determine both the depth and the breadth of the content. So how deep do I need to go into the subject material, and how vast do I need the subject material to stretch? So what are goals and objectives? A goal, a physiological objective about what learning is intended to produce. An example of this, a goal of this chapter is to explain the concept of basic airway management. Objectives. The word objectives mean observable. There are 4 parts to the objective. 1, who is your target audience? What is the expected behavior? A condition in which the behavior will be performed. A measurement tool or strategy used to evaluate the objective for successful completion. So even though you have a target audience and you have an expected behavior that you would like to see in this, and you've set up the stage or a condition under which the behavior will be performed, there still has to be an applicable measurement tool in the lesson plan for that specific objective. If that would be then the case, and we'll talk about rubrics later on here in this slide set. If this has to be, or if you need a rubric to evaluate something that it has some subjectivity to it, then you need to build a rubric for that. An example of this: so students will use their own words to correctly define at least 5 of the following 6 terms pertaining to respiratory emergencies: dyspnea, apnea, eupnea, hyperpnea, tachypnea, and bradypnea. So they're going to use 5 of those out of the 6 terms listed to describe, in their own words, respiratory emergencies. So they would have to understand in a naturalized state what dyspnea and all of those terms meant. So knowledge base would come into that. This is the overall goal of your lesson plan. So in a lesson plan, and whenever we're speaking about chapters in a book, the lesson plans very simply can be isolated just to that chapter, or it can be broader, and an example of this would be like for a whole section. So if you had a preparatory section of EMT Basic or a preparatory section of paramedic, then those goals and objectives would be quite broad at that point. Performance agreement. A link between goals and objectives is established through the evaluation process called a performance agreement. So every goal and objective needs to have a performance agreement, and we're going to kind of describe those, and this will help you also troubleshoot your lesson plans. A performance agreement is the process of critically evaluating the goals and objectives for the purpose of validating their relationship to one another. So this right here is an example of a performance agreement, and this guy right here, this has a performance agreement, and this one here does not. So no performance agreement and performance agreement. And if you want to kind of read on your own here for a second, to right here on both of them, they're the same. Alright, so objectives. On a written test to 90% accuracy, the student will be able to bam, 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 and it comes up with explain how a pulse is generated. Label a diagram with 4 locations commonly used to assess the pulse. Outline the technique to assess the pulse. So all of these are the same on both pages, or both of these sections, the one with no performance agreement and the one with performance agreement, until where I drew this line. Now, here's where I bring note. The first thing that you're talking about in your objectives is to explain how a pulse is generated. So this one here, pulse generation. and it has two areas that you'll talk about in the lesson: the heart rate and arterial blood flow. And that would cover very basically how a pulse is generated. Over here, the first thing that you start with, and this is structure, right? A flow to the actual lesson, that the first thing that started with over here is pulse locations. Okay, well, did we ever talk about, if we start about pulse locations, did we ever talk about how a pulse is generated? Even though it is one of your objectives up here. And the answer is no. So that's why this section here has a performance agreement, and this one here does not. Okay, so components of an objective. There's two models in constructing the order of an objective. There's the ABCD method, and essentially we're going to pretty much target the audience, tell about the behavior, apply the conditions, and give it a degree. Now this is my favorite way of actually looking at them. It's right here. Or there's CABD method. Given a condition, and then talk about your audience, and then the behavior, and then apply a degree. So in this next section here, we're going to talk about all of these areas. We're going to talk about the audience, the behavior, the condition, and the degree, and start talking about what a rubric actually is. The audience. The audience describes the receiver or the student of the actual instructional activity. The intended audience should match the actual audience for the instruction. An example of this is trying to teach advanced cardiac life support to a basic life support audience. There needs to be some preparatory work. Their education should essentially be like a set of stairs. I apologize, I can't even speak today. A set of stairs that we have foundation here, and then here, and then here, and their education progresses. There shouldn't be holes in the staircase. So if you have a BLS, or the knowledge level of the BLS audience is kind of here, and you're speaking up here, and there's no bridge, that would be difficult for them to understand the concepts or really get a grasp on what you're trying to educate. Behavior. So the audience is very important. That was the first part. The next one is behavior. Behavior. The behavior statement describes the expected outcome or capability the learner should exhibit after the instructional event has occurred. So after you get through instructing, the behavior will say what they come away with. An example. And one of these is a bad example, and the other one is a good example. So I'm going to read both of these objectives. I'll start off with this one here. Objective 1. The student will identify equipment used to immobilize a patient to a long spine board. Okay, so that does have some parts to it. An example of this, the audience is identified, and the behavior is identified, but it doesn't articulate anything about the condition or degree in that first objective. And again, condition. Circumstances that would influence the actual performance is what we're talking about whenever we talk about the condition, and the degree, the actual measurement tool that you're going to use to assess the student. So, objective 2 here. Given a BLS ambulance stocked with all the required equipment and supplies identified by the state protocol, the student will identify every piece of equipment used to immobilize a patient to a long backboard. Now, that is pretty explicit. Objective 2 tells both the instructor and the student that they will be required to identify all the required equipment and supplies, and that they will be working with an ambulance stocked according to an established standard. So objective 2 is going to win the objective award here out of these two examples. So objective 2 is more complete. Again, an ABCD method. Audience, behavior, condition, and degree. Condition. The condition portion of the ABCD objective describes any circumstances that influence the performance of behavior. And some examples of this are going to be, and these are the examples here, this area, in swift running water with Class 2 rapids. Another example is given a table of assorted splitting equipment. And another example of this is within 1 minute. So these are the conditions that will be applied for this actual test, or whatever the test might be to this point. A well-thought condition leaves little room for surprises during the test. Degree. The degree portion of the objectives provides the standard of accuracy required for acceptable performance. It describes the actual measurement tool used to assess the student's performance and clearly identifies the point at which the student will be successful. An example of this, using therapeutic communication strategies throughout the simulation. Now this is in verbiage that would be in the middle of your statements here, but still we would want to see that the student exhibited therapeutic communication strategies while he was in this simulation, very simply. Now, again, a good way to identify this is going to be with a rubric, and we'll talk about rubrics here a little later on, and I've made a whole slide set over rubrics, so please view that. Number 2, by using all of the effective domain characteristics described in the chapter that apply to this scenario. So again, the behavioral characteristics described in this chapter, please apply it to this scenario without committing any critical fail points. This is another more simpler version of it down here. So all of these apply a degree, and what actual measurement tool is going to be used. So in each one of these, this is the punchline, right? The punchline on the assessment. So again, A, B, C, D. Audience, what's your behavior? What conditions need to be applied? And the actual degree. Now, I will post the rubric for the assignment on the Blackboard as well. So it will essentially be A, B, C, D, and did the student, which is you, clearly define in their goals and objectives their audience, their behavior, their condition, and their degree. Quantitative and qualitative. Objective measurements can be measured through these means as well. Quantitative criteria identifies behaviors through conditions that impose or describe limitations. And examples of these are lowest acceptable passing score, time limits that you've applied, or number of attempts. Qualitative criteria include non-numerical observations that show dimensions or pattern relationship. Examples of this, expression of a value, acceptance of a concept or idea, which is very subjective, defending a decision or action. And whenever we get into these areas here, quantitative and qualitative, you almost have to have a rubric to assess it appropriately or to provide a standard of assessment. And rubrics are helpful in making qualitative measurements. So, we've talked about them many times so far, so here we go. What are rubrics? A rubric is a grading tool that uses scales to provide a framework to score a student's performance. And this is used for both qualitative and quantitative evaluations. Rubrics provide concrete examples of expected behavior or content. So these are rubrics are essentially the rules of engagement for your assessment. A rubric is an excellent tool when grading something that is subjective. And there is a whole, I've made a completely separate slide section over this, and it's called Rubrics 101, and it's also located in this section on Blackboard. So please view that. We'll talk you over the process of making a rubric. One of your assignments for this specific chapter is going to be to develop a rubric for assessing your lesson plan. Terminology and precision. Objectives must be written with clear, unambiguous terminology that is free of jargon. We can't use 10 codes, very simply. They need to be clear and concise, or our ability to communicate. Acronyms should be clearly defined. Statements must be observable and measurable. So if you cannot view or you cannot easily see this statement or measure this statement, then it's probably not a good one. That's simple. Objectives are always result oriented. So an example of this, if I give you an objective and the result was not good on this, then we need to probably redefine and relook at our objectives and assess it. Not only assessing the objective itself, but maybe assessing the delivery of the content for the objective. And figure 8.1 in your books kind of covers this a little bit. And this goes back to the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And we have 3 domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. And this is essentially cognitive. Do you have knowledge? Is there comprehension? And can you apply it? Can you analyze this knowledge that you now have? Can you synthesize the knowledge from various areas? And then can you yourself evaluate? So these are some appropriate verbs in Bloom's taxonomy that will help with this. Now this is, again, is table 8.1 in your book. In the affective, same way. Receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and then characterizing. All of these are different levels of affective domain. And these are all action verbs that is for you to actually write objectives and goals from these areas that would be appropriate. These are psychomotor levels, and these are also verbs for the psychomotor levels. So take a good look at this. This will help you in building your objectives and your goals in assignment. The relationship between the domains of learning and objectives. There's a strong link between objectives and domains, and we just kind of talked about those: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective, and there are varying levels. So whenever you're looking at a rubric or looking at developing a rubric, there should be probably 3 levels of rubrics. 1, do they have the knowledge base? 2, can they actually apply what you're looking for? And then 3, if we really threw a curveball in there, could there be some problem solving? And could that be assessed? Now those are all questions you have to ask whenever you're building a rubric. Goals and objectives and the evaluation process. Once the level has been identified, the instructor can determine which level the evaluation tool should be used. The tool can target any level. You can look at level 1, and those were the levels that we just talked about earlier. Level 1, level 2, level 3, knowledge, application, or essentially mastery, or problem solving. Summary tools should focus on the higher levels, level 2 and level 3. Can they actually apply this? And if I threw them a curveball, would they be able to get past it? So, in summary, goals and objectives clarify for the educator and for the student precisely what learning should take place and how learning will be evaluated. The use of the ABCD method to write the objectives is the easiest way. Again, audience, behavior, condition, and degree. Evaluate the performance agreement to determine the appropriateness of the depth and the breadth. Depth and breadth are how deep do I need to go into this content? How detailed and how much knowledge base in this specific content do I need to get as far as the depth? And the breadth is the vast knowledge. So whenever we're talking about things like, can a medic run a medical call, the breadth on a medical call could be immense. But we specifically need him to have depth in these areas. Goals and objectives are used in the decision about appropriate evaluation tools. If you have any questions concerning this chapter, feel free to give me a call. My name is Roy Smith, smithr@imsa.net, or 405-219-7613. Thank you.